Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Have you ever felt like city life, despite all its perks, can sometimes be a little too crowded?
Yeah,
Well, today we're going to explore some research that might just explain why.
that's right. We're going to be diving into the world of megacities and something called rat utopias.
Rat utopias.
Yes,
Okay.
we'll be looking at the work of John B. Calhoun and his fascinating rat utopia experiments.
So those experiments are kind of infamous in some circles.
Yes.
For people who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown?
Yeah. So back in the 1960s and 70s, Calhoun created what seemed like a perfect world for rats. Unlimited food, water, nesting materials, everything a rat could ever want.
A rodent paradise.
Right. But there was a catch.
Okay.
Space was limited, and that's where things get really interesting.
All right, so what happened to these pampered rodents?
Well, despite having everything they needed, these rat utopias ultimately collapsed.
Really?
Yeah, and it wasn't from starvation or disease, but from the psychological effects of overcrowding. Calhoun actually identified 4 key phases that these populations went through.
Okay, so let's break down these phases. How did these rat utopias unfold?
Okay, so the first phase was what Calhoun called the strive period. This was a time of rapid population growth. Resources were plentiful, everyone's happy and reproducing like crazy. It's kind of like the early days of any booming city full of opportunity and excitement.
Makes sense so far. What happened next?
Things settled down a bit in the second phase, the equilibrium period. Social structures begin to emerge and birth rates level off as the population kind of stabilizes.
Okay, so far so good, right?
Right. But then as the population continued to increase, the utopia started to unravel.
Oh.
This is where we enter the third phase, the breakdown period.
Yeah.
And things take a bit of a dark turn.
Okay, this is where it starts to sound a little ominous. What exactly was breaking down?
Think about the worst parts of city life aggression, social isolation, even violence.
Oh, wow.
That's what started to happen in the rat utopia. Overcrowding led to increased aggression. Social norms crumbled, and we saw a rise in abnormal behaviors like neglect of offspring,
Oh.
even a sort of social withdrawal where rats would isolate themselves completely.
So kind of like those hikikomoris we discussed in a previous episode.
Exactly. It's a more extreme example in humans, obviously.
Sure.
But it points to a similar trend of social withdrawal and isolation, even when surrounded by millions of people.
It's interesting that this breakdown happened even though the rats had everything they needed materially.
That's what's so fascinating and perhaps disturbing about these experiments.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's a point where density itself becomes a stressor, regardless of resource availability.
And this ultimately led to the fourth and final phase.
Yes, the die-off period. Despite having everything they needed to survive, the rat population plummeted towards extinction.
Wow. That is unsettling.
Yeah.
So even in a utopia, things can go very wrong when overcrowding takes hold. But how does this relate to us living in our modern megacities?
Well, it's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And while we aren't rats, these experiments raise some critical questions about human behavior in increasingly dense urban environments. For instance, think about the rising rates of unrest and social friction in major cities around the world.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Protests, political polarization, just this general feeling of unease that seems to be bubbling under the surface in so many places.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of declining birth rates
Yeah.
in many developed countries, particularly in dense urban areas.
It's interesting you bring that up because I was just reading an article the other day about how birth rates are plummeting in South Korea,
Yeah.
one of the most densely populated countries in the world.
It's a complex issue, of course, with multiple factors, but it's hard not to see a connection to the pressures of urban life.
So are we seeing echoes of Calhoun's behavioral sink playing out in our cities?
It's a valid concern, and it's not just about those extreme examples like the hikikomori we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The behavioral sink can manifest in more subtle ways, too, like increased anxiety, a sense of detachment from one's community, even a decline in civic engagement.
So what can we do about it? Are we doomed to repeat the fate of those rats in Calhoun's experiment?
Not necessarily. Unlike rats, we have the capacity for awareness and the ability to shape our environments. We can choose to design our cities differently.
But are we doing that? It seems like we're actually moving towards even greater density with concepts like the 15-minute city.
That's an important point, and while the 15-minute city model aims to create vibrant, walkable communities, it could backfire if not implemented thoughtfully.
What do you mean by thoughtfully? How can we ensure that these 15-minute cities don't become human versions of those rat utopias?
For one thing, we need to focus on quality of living spaces over sheer density. Cramming people into tiny apartments, even if they are stylish, won't create a thriving community.
So more parks, more green spaces, more room to breathe.
Absolutely. We need to design with human psychology in mind. Think about how spaces encourage or discourage interaction. Do they foster a sense of belonging, or do they make people feel isolated?
It's not just about the physical layout of a city, but about the social dynamics as well.
Exactly. And this is where social connectivity comes in. We need to design cities that foster a sense of community.
How do we do that? What are some concrete examples?
Think community gardens, local events, volunteer opportunities, anything that brings people together in meaningful ways. We need to create those third places, those spaces that are neither home nor work, but where people can connect organically. And we can't forget about mental health support.
Yeah.
Access to affordable quality mental health services is crucial, especially in high-density areas.
This is starting to sound like a pretty tall order.
It is,
Yeah.
but I think Calhoun's work, while sobering, also offers us hope. It's a reminder that we're not simply at the mercy of our environment. We have the power to shape our cities and our future.
So what does a successful human utopia look like in the 21st century? What can we learn from Calhoun's rat utopias to create thriving urban communities?
That is the question, isn't it? What can those rat utopias teach us about building better cities for humans?
Yeah.
Well, I think for starters, it highlights the importance of understanding human needs beyond the purely physical.
Right.
We need to think about what makes people feel connected, engaged, and purposeful. It's not enough to simply provide food, shelter, and entertainment. We need to create environments that nurture the human spirit.
So it's not just about building better rat cages, so to speak, but about understanding what truly allows humans to thrive.
Exactly, and I think Calhoun would argue that this requires a conscious effort to design social structures and environments that foster cooperation, creativity, and a sense of belonging.
That's a fascinating concept. It's like we need to become architects of human interaction. But what would that look like in practice?
Imagine cities designed not just for efficiency, but for serendipity.
Serendipity.
Spaces that encourage chance encounters, that foster connections across generations and cultures, that celebrate diversity of thought and experience.
I like that.
Think about those water cooler moments that spark new ideas and collaborations.
Right.
We need to create those kinds of opportunities on a citywide scale.
So more parks, more community centers, more places where people can just bump into each other and connect.
Precisely. And we need to recognize the importance of play, of creativity, of those seemingly non-productive activities that actually nourish our minds and spirits.
So more art installations, more music venues, more spaces for people to just be.
Absolutely. And we need to foster a culture that values community involvement, civic engagement, and a sense of shared responsibility for our collective well-being. We need to move away from the hyper-individualism that often characterizes modern urban life.
That sounds like a pretty radical departure from our current way of thinking.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I think it's a necessary shift if we want to create truly sustainable and thriving human communities. We need to remember that we're social creatures at our core, and our well-being is interconnected.
It makes you wonder what kind of human utopia Calhoun would have envisioned if he were alive today.
I think he would have challenged us to look beyond simple solutions and to embrace the complexity of human behavior. He would have reminded us that we have the power to shape our future, but that it requires a deep understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.
Well, those are certainly some thought-provoking ideas to consider. It seems like creating a thriving city is about much more than just bricks and mortar. It's about fostering a sense of community connection and shared purpose.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where people feel valued, supported, and empowered to contribute to something larger than themselves.
Well, that's a great note to wrap up on. If you had to sum up the key takeaway from our deep dive into megacities and rat utopias, what would it be?
I think the main takeaway is this. Density itself isn't the problem. It's how we design for it. We have the tools and the knowledge to create cities that foster human flourishing even in the face of increasing density. But it requires a shift in thinking, a move away from prioritizing efficiency and individual gain towards a focus on community connection and the well-being of all.
That's a powerful message. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope this exploration has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to think differently about the future of our cities.
We encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts and ideas for creating thriving human communities using the hashtag #NoToRatUtopia.
Love that.
Let's work together to build a future where our cities are not just places to live, but places to thrive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep connecting.
Welcome back, everybody.